This recording is an interview of Ram Dass made on May 10, 1980 in Eugene, Oregon. The interviewer is Amrit Goswami, an Indian-born physicist.
It seems that you have been with a person who have been like our electrons in some way, because electrons are acausal. We have known that since 1930s, actually. Quantum mechanics is a theory which indeed puts the electrons quite respectfully in their, accepts them in their acausality, so to say. And here we are with gurus, whom also we are forced to accept in their acausal behavior. But of course, the problem that people have is that there are only few of these gurus. So for electrons, we can always
plenty of them.
Plenty of them.
Well, I don't know that we are ready for them anyway, or that we would know what to do about them. It's interesting. I've often been approached by, when my guru was in his body prior to 1973, I've been approached by Western scientists who have said, we would like to go and study your guru. Now, to me, every time I think of that, I almost laugh inside, because my guru, for him to be studied, somehow in my mind, it's like an elephant being studied by an ant. I would like to honor Western science, but I realize that it isn't measurable that way. It has to come from a great deal more humility than that. And it's lacking in Western science at this point, to really open to what that phenomenon is of a guru in the East.
Yes, I'll put it in a slightly different way, which is that in order to go into this venture, a scientist scientists really have to become disciples. That is, they have to start to use their body as a laboratory of whatever they're trying to find. And in that place, probably, like if you were studying, if you were a physicist or the scientist who wanted to study Maharaji, you could, right? And you did to some extent. Your books make it very clear that you were studying him behaviorally.
Exactly. But there are two interesting associations to what you just said. One was Carl Jung's eulogy of Richard Wilhelm, who did the I Ching. He translated the I Ching originally. And he went to another culture, and as Carl Jung pointed out, he brought the culture back in his bloodstream, in his being, not in his knowing, but his being. He became the culture itself, and then came back and made that functioned as what Carl called a Gnostic intermediary, of somebody who moved from one to the other. But Carl Jung then points out, but it finally drove him insane, because he couldn't integrate the two systems. And it is insane as long as you try to hold to one or the other. You've got to let go of both in order to become something that is more than either of them. That's the first point. The other one was that I remember when I was at Harvard, and we were being criticized for our research with chemicals that alter consciousness. And the criticism was from a behaviorist point of view, that we weren't being sufficiently stringent in our behaviorist criteria. And Tim Leary, my partner at that time, argued that we were doing traditional introspection research, which had a history in psychology, although it's not in vogue in the behaviorist zeitgeist. And I remember at that point, I realized my predicament, and I said to the group, I'm making a different decision. I'm not pleading that I am any longer functioning in the formal role of being a scientist. I am going to go the journey, and what will come out will come out. I must be now considered a datum, right? And you may study me if you choose, but I can't keep one foot in the door to come back and keep observing what's happening to me. I've got to let it happen and then hope it comes out. I may just go insane, I don't know, but I've got to keep going. And that was really a basic decision in my life, as I recall.
You decided to be what quantum mechanics tells us all the time. That is, there is no division between subjects and objects. Why try?
Why try? Why try? That the dualistic mind is a limiting factor in our understanding the universe, even though it seems to have tremendous power. It's like prehensile ability. It gives us a lot of power, but it's only one kind of power. And it's a very trivial kind of power in a certain way in the larger domain of power. The question is how we can use intuitive understanding in any systematic fashion.
That's right. And then the bigger question will come that if we could, then would we get into powers from which there is no return and new catastrophe starts happening?
Yeah.
I have heard this worry that if the miraculous were accepted and people could do them, then what would happen to the world as we see it?
Well, it's an interesting one because hopefully one would expect that wisdom and compassion went along with siddhis or powers. In fact, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. And there have been examples like Rasputin, historically, of people who have gained great siddhis or great spiritual powers, but did not have compassion.
Or Ravana, the one that...
Ravana, yes,
in
the
Ramayana.
I don't think that... I think that if those powers were available without surrendering one's ego or sense of separateness, they would be misused. And I think the game is beautifully designed that they really aren't available to most people.
And perhaps that's where the acausality comes in. I mean, you cannot really make to order a miracle. A miracle just happens.
Yeah.
There's always that, what Carl Jung used to call synchronous element
Exactly.
in the happening of a miracle.
And what's interesting about that is that in the West, when people conceive of people doing miracles, like I watched recently a film on television about Christ, and it was a beautifully done film, an Italian film, and when they showed Christ doing a miracle, he was always somebody who was like, he was about to do the miracle, you know, and then he did the miracle, and you could see him thinking about the miracle. Around Maharaji, I could see that isn't the way it is at all. Miracles just happened around him. He didn't do anything. The whole idea of somebody who does a miracle is exactly our Western projection into it, which is fun to think about.
Exactly. So somehow the causality and the predicament that you have to preserve causality is very much into the mind of these enlightened gurus. They know.
Well, I get a sense that as well as I could try to project in and grasp, that Maharaji was so much in harmony with the laws of the universe, the way form manifested, that there were certain ways in which his powers wouldn't manifest, and certain ways they would. They would only manifest within Dharma, within the laws of that were harmonious. You know?
The difference is that he knew the laws. And
he was the law.
He was the
law. See,
okay.
it's again, the knowing is gone too. It's not like he said, well, I won't cure that person, because you'd say, well, why does he cure that person and not that person? You know? And then sometimes he'd give a reason, but the reason always seemed like the reason for the mind of the other person. The reason didn't seem like the reason why he did that. Like there's a story of a man coming, his wife is sick, and he gives him a stick and he says, put it under her pillow. And she gets better, and then they look and the stick is gone, and they come back and they say, Maharaji, where's the stick? And he says, what do you want the stick for? You've got your wife. And then another man says, look, I have an old mother that's sick, give me a stick. And he says, she's old, let her die. Now, under those conditions, he seems to be giving a reason. Old people can die, young people, you know, things like that. But that didn't follow either. I was trying in this book I just did, Miracle of Love, which is just a lot of stories about Maharaji, to convey that you couldn't build any one system. If you said, well, he rationally did this, therefore, and extrapolated out, he would block you at the next moment. Right?
Yeah, and that would be causal behavior, and then of
Exactly.
course, the miracle could not be explained at all.
Exactly.
In fact, if one takes a position like this, and we are, as scientists, are very close to take a position, some of us, that the new paradigm must encompass both the causal element of nature with the causal element, and put both of them in their proper place, and say that, well, these are complementary aspects of reality. Reality can manifest itself in causal, what we see and very used to, but also the acausal, which are not used to, but happens all the time. We're just not used to it. We don't perceive them. But perhaps the miracle is not as unusual as we perceive them to be.
No, it feels to me that once you move outside in your awareness of time and space, for example, as your reference point, and then come back into time and space to look, they all seem perfectly natural within another form of law. They don't seem natural when you're trying to use a causal, linear, analytic form to understand them. It's just a different place of looking, and then it seems like nothing special. And you could feel from Maharaji that it didn't seem like anything special. But the question is, can the human intellect really handle an acausal system?
That is a very good question. In mathematics, they are now finding out that there are some equations which drive themselves, in the sense that you do not anticipate the result. Whatever the mathematics will give you, it will give it. And so that has that acausal element. I sort of feel that it may have the acausal element. You know, there is a very interesting belief among physicists that God must be a mathematician. And of course, you know, the belief is that mathematics transcends reason.
I understand.
And mathematics transcends our causal system to that extent. So if mathematics someday is able to handle acausality, I would not be too surprised somehow.
Can you see that it does that? I mean,
not yet. No, definitely not yet. But you know, this mathematics is invented to
because it's still conceptual symbology,
yes.
And therefore it still is all mediated through, or at least perceived or formulated through the mind,
yes.
through the intellect, through
yes.
what's usually called the left hemisphere.
Yet, if we are part of one cosmic consciousness, then it makes sense. I mean, as you say very clearly, that the one becomes two in order to look at itself.
Yeah.
And in the state of two, it can look, and it can look at all the reality.
Yeah.
And that includes what its unitive aspect is. So from that point of view, I would not be too surprised if an unpredictive mathematics could handle this. And so long as it's unpredictive, I'm not surprised.
Unpredictive.
Unpredictive.
Oh, that's a nice one. Okay. Yeah. Right.
I mean, all you have, you know, all Maharaji is telling us, and you have been telling us, is that we must admit the acausal. But this mathematics is acausal in that sense, if it turns out to be what I think it might turn out to be.
But it's interesting about the word apredictive, because when you are outside of time and space, you definitely understand that the future already exists. Now, how do you deal with the concept of apredictive in that?
And also, I don't know. Also, the tremendous difficulty that all of us have in understanding nonlinear time, the entire past, present, future existing together.
Yeah.
That by itself is a tremendous mystery to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think of that? Do you ever think of it, or do you just experience it? It cannot be thought of, it seems like.
It feels as if, like when Einstein said, I didn't arrive at my understanding of the fundamental laws through my rational mind. It seems to me what he's describing is a transcendent state in which he moves outside of the matrix of time and space into a more gestalt perception of the universe, which has in it past, present, and future. And then he comes back into his rational, linear, analytic mind, and his training as a physicist allows him to bring back from that totality some little sub-bit of information, just as Bach brings it back, or or it's brought back in a rag or something like that, and it's not that kind of knowledge is not something you can know; it's something you can be. Then you can only know about it as almost a memory. It's a memory trace. You can know a little bit about it.
Just witness how the knowledge or wisdom gets into your being.
Yeah.
And then you are aware of it.
Then you're aware of it. Then it's coming out of your... That's like the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge is a much lower level game than wisdom is. Wisdom is a way of being in the universe. It's subjective, if you will. It's a subjective relationship. Knowledge is objective. And knowledge is really one step back. It's one thought away from being in the universe, if you will. It's always, that's where the separateness is.
That's right. And then that's where our basic feeling comes from, of integrating the paradigms. Because in physics we have acknowledged that subject-object division does not really exist in reality.
Yeah.
And therefore it is essential to mix them. But of course the scientist is always scared what happens if we mix them? Shall we ever find out what truth? Namely, he's still thinking of objective truth. Yes. But at the same time, he realizes the paradox that there is no objective truth.
Yes.
So knowledge
now,
and wisdom...
what does that mean? Does that mean that we have to change what we mean by truth? Because it seems to me that what you know with the mind is only relative truth.
That's right.
And that absolute truth has no form to it.
That's right.
You know, it is not conceivable. Absolute truth isn't conceivable.
And the only way you can approach it is by being. And that state of being is, of course, what the Eastern practices are about, and the mystical practices are about.
That's what the basic distinction is between religion and science, if you will.
Yes.
You know? That's why, like in Western religions, God is inconceivable. It's like not even, you can't even say the name, because you can't get to that, you can't get that close.
That's right. In your tradition, did you grow up, you sort of grew up with that, didn't you? I mean, that you cannot say the name of God.
Yeah.
I grew up in a system where, of course, God is everywhere, and whatever you are saying God.
Yes.
Most Hindu names are God.
That's saying the same thing. It's just saying it from a different place.
Yes.
It's just saying it has no unique name.
That's right.
Because the minute you categorize it as that, it isn't that. You know?
But it's interesting how there are two ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But both are doing this ritual. Both are excluding the possibility of experiencing God in some extent. You know, this brings me to one question. In India, the system is really very elite, the spirituality bit, and people accept it. But in reality, they know that only a few people are going to be knowing God. And then they accept it, and that helps them with their karma. But they never venture to be it.
I understand.
Now, in science, of course, we do things very democratically. That is, if we have a realization, then we want it for everybody, like electricity.
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
Well, the Eastern, the security that comes with a paradigm that involves reincarnation makes it altogether different, because you understand that your turn will come and that you're playing your part, and that, like, I noticed in the 1960s when we first started to work with psychedelic chemicals, we expected every one of us to get enlightened at any second, right? Because that was the Western achievement. You can take it, grab it, and become that. And every time, the question was whether it would happen at, 10 or on Tuesday, or when it would happen. And then we got a little, and I'd go to India, and I'd notice that none of the people that were around my guru ever talked about when they would get enlightened. And I couldn't understand it. Wasn't everybody wanting to get enlightened? And then I realized that time wasn't the dimension any longer.
That's right.
More was whether you were doing your part in the incarnation. And that's taken me years to learn. That is a certain humility that has come out of a deeper understanding of the timeless quality of time, in which time is a subsystem.
That's right. An existence where you live in space-time, yet there is a reality where space and time doesn't mean a thing.
Exactly. And that's why, even though the Eastern system looks elitist, within the Western system, it isn't basically elitist. It's just as democratic. It's just a timing matter. Everybody is doing their part, and if you were a good sweeper, a dharmic sweeper, you are doing the same as a king is doing who's doing the king's dharma, In the West, everybody wants to be the king, but in the East, everybody doesn't want to be the king. Everybody wants to do the dharma. Beautifully
put. So what you're saying is that in space, the discrimination that one becomes divided into many. And in time, what happens is this what you just described, that not only one becomes many, but also the many plays different roles.
Different roles across time.
Across time.
Yeah. And then when it all gets telescoped back in, and then you're outside of time and space. Like I'd see my guru looking at me, and he'd say things to me like, he'd say, Lincoln was a good president. I'd say, yes. He'd say, yes, because he knew Christ was president. He was only acting president. I'd say, yes. He'd say, did you know Lincoln? And I'd say, did I know Lincoln? Like Lincoln lived in 1860, Or he'd look at me, and sometimes he'd say to me, Samat Guru Ramdas. Now, Samat Guru Ramdas lived in 1600.
That's right.
And I began to think, is this man crazy? Or is it another possibility that he is telescoping incarnations? He's standing back where not only your past, present, and future in this life, but lives are all there. and he's just seeing the scope. And then for us to impose upon him the limits of our own sense information is exactly where the whole thing becomes absurd.
Particularly when you realize that not only just a series of lives, but every life that ever happened is all our own incarnations.
It's all us.
All us.
It's all us. And that's, Jung was approaching that with his collective unconscious, the concept of collective unconscious. That's as close as we could get in the West with that idea.
Actually, I have a feeling that we probably will be going further with it. I mean, there is this branch of transpersonal psychology, which you have been associated with it to some extent. I have seen your name in the journal's advisory board. It used to be, but not anymore.
Yeah.
How do you feel about transpersonal psychology? Do you think that it is possible to have an academic discipline which will be able to talk about religion in a scientific, academic manner?
Boy, that's a delicate question. Finally, these academicians must turn the light back in on themselves. And finally, how much they're going to find out is how deeply they have done their own inner work. And the problem is that as long as you keep the traditional Western metaphor of science, it is still studying something out there. Without even though we now are sophisticated enough to say that the experimenter enters into the experiment, we haven't gotten to the point where you start to manipulate the experimenter in order to change the perceptual viewpoint. And that's really what transpersonal psychology's got to struggle with. And most of the people that are in transpersonal psychology do not work very hard on themselves. They use the language of the East and of the mystic tradition, and they are trying to deal with these issues, but they are primarily defining themselves as social scientists, not as students of God or as inner working people. It's a delicate one, because there are some that are doing that, but generally that's what's required.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I mean, it really has to be that scientists got to start meditating.
Exactly.
And whatever comes out.
Yes. That's the bottom line of the whole game, yes.
Now, in meditation, the problem that scientists should, again, Western, in the sense of being a Western scientist, it's really, from the outset, doesn't seem to be a very difficult proposition. Not even a very taking too much time type proposition. I mean, after all, I have seen physicists doing one thing for 10 years.
Yeah.
He can do that. And why shouldn't he be able to meditate for 10 years and see what happens? But yet, there's tremendous reluctance.
Well, because meditation has always been seen by the West as that kind of mushy, mystical domain. And it's interesting because if you take, for example, the Theravadan Buddhist tradition and the Tripitaka and the basic texts of the Theravadan tradition and the Vedantic traditions and Vedic prescriptions, you see an exquisitely articulated psychology of the human mind that we in the West don't have anything compared to it in terms of the subtlety. I mean, the Visuddhimagga of Southern Buddhism is one of the most exquisite maps of the human thinking process that I've ever seen, and we don't have anything remotely as sophisticated as that.
That's right. This just has not been studied.
And once one approaches meditation in that kind of systematic way of understanding that through meditation you can change the point from which you are perceiving time and space to the point where you can stand behind your own thought forms and watch the thoughts appear, exist, and disappear, which is extraordinary. Like that Buddha describes the last 34 mind moments before he goes into nirvana. All right? Those mind moments are happening at the rate of about 1 trillion per blink of an eye, is the rough estimate. And yet he's describing 34 of them discretely, one by one. Now, how could he do that if he didn't get outside of time so that the minutiae, the microsystem, he could spread it out and look at each one discretely? We can't conceive of that because of our identification with our thinking process.
Yes, and also the identification occurs in sometimes very articulate manner. We are talking about this going out of time, and ultimately it boils down to going out of the body, going out in a way which is called transcendence.
Yeah.
And if you look at the human mind from the artificial intelligence point of view, which a lot of very intelligent people are doing, the computer model of human being. In the computer model, of course, it's all a delusion that you go out or you transcend.
Of course.
There is an example which has been given in one of the books, which is of the Escher picture, where a dragon is trying to go out of a page, and it makes a hole, and it goes out and comes back into a hole. Yet anybody who looks at the dragon's picture knows that the dragon is not getting anywhere. It's a delusion.
It's beautiful.
So they say, well, that's what happens to people who talk about transcendence. You aren't really going anywhere, but you're just deluding.
Sure, that's exactly, for example, Freud. I used to teach Freud, and Freud said all religion and spiritual concerns are merely sublimated sexuality. They're merely displaced sexuality. And you can see, like within the chakra system, that every chakra has its own reality. And that you try to explain some phenomenon that's associated with another chakra, you reduce it to within that chakra system or that subsystem to explain.
So you are stuck with the phenomena that you start with, because your method of studying
you only
it
see yourself out there. You only see yourself. So you got to change yourself to see something else.
That's right.
And that's what the Western scientist isn't quite ready to buy yet. Because we are attached to our senses and our thinking mind, and those are the attachments that ultimately stop the process.
Mm-hmm.
We are attached to those as our vehicles for knowing. And we have to let go of those vehicles, and we yet haven't got the respect for what is other than that, which we might call awareness or Atman or whatever you want to call it. You know.
What my hope is that if we could make some scientific, quote-unquote, advancement in the process by which transcendence takes place. I say process because if what happens in transcendence is something that you can only be, but the process can be studied. For example, there is some neurochemical, neuropharmacological studies which has now been able to differentiate between the meditative processes versus the processes that happen in drug experience. For example, in under LSD, what happens is that the brain becomes hyper aroused because of some neurochemicals that you would
synapse,
That's right.
Yeah.
And in meditation, on the other hand, the brain is hypo aroused because of again a neurochemical.
Well, all the shifts in like alpha rhythms, the increase in alpha and things like that with meditation, all the EEG, all of it raises some interesting issues about whether these are correlates, which is always the issue about measurement, whether these are correlates of the phenomenon or these are the phenomenon, because I really am not very impressed with the fact that the brain has much to do with the higher meditative state.
I have no doubt that these are correlates. But let me raise an interesting question, because you are one of the people who have experience with meditation as well as the drug. Now, the brain goes through two very different processes. That is, when you meditate, you slow down the mind to some extent. Whereas when you are into drug experience, then the mind is actually acting very fast. So perhaps this is an approach of the consciousness or ultimate consciousness that we talk about in two different ways. And there is actually one suggestion. A man named Roland Fisher, I think, has actually suggested that a rupture can take place from samadhi into this state of tremendous hyperarousal. And another man has come very close to it, and I'll just add to it and say it, that is the process of raising the kundalini. Now, in your experience, when you have described it, I think in Only Dance There Is, that suddenly your breath disappeared and you felt energetic. Now, this process, does that even remotely correspond to going from a state of tranquility into a tremendously aroused state?
It certainly could. It's interesting. Most of the are you measuring the arousal in biochemical terms or in electrical potential terms in the brain, or what?
In both terms.
See, because the subjective psychological experience with psychotropic, with chemicals that alter consciousness, like LSD, is a speeding up of thought process in the initial stages until it gets to a point where it breaks. There's a discontinuous moment. And then you enter into a space in which it's a cosmic awareness, in which there's no thought anymore. In the early stages, which might be what's measured most of the time, there is an agitation until you break out of, until it gets to a point where it breaks. There's almost a discontinuous moment. And then you enter into a space in which it's a cosmic awareness, in which there's no thought anymore. In the early stages, which might be what's measured most of the time, there is an agitation until you break out of, it's a breaking out of something.
And you have felt that break. I mean, that
Yes.
break was what I
I
was
felt
talking
that
about.
continuity every time that has happened. It gets very subtle, but I can still experience it.
How about coming? Let's talk about yourself a little bit, because I think that you put all this in some perspective. You played a very important role at just at the right time. I'll tell you a personal anecdote. I was teaching a class on time and Einstein's relativity. And then I was going over these concepts of how you define the here-now point, and I was doing something which is rather mathematical and interesting geometrically, a thing called light cone, and I was putting in the center of it, I was putting the here-now point, I was saying that, well, that's where it all is, and then here's the past and here's the future. And then I went away from that a little bit and talked about nonlinear concepts of time too. At the end of the class, a student came to me and said, what is this here now point? So I tried to answer this way. I quoted T.S. Eliot, the still point, but finally I didn't get anywhere. Then finally I said, look, there is a guy named Ramdas who has written a book, Be Here Now. Read that. Maybe you'll get somewhere with it.
That's lovely.
So you started that in America. Do you see that do you feel that was your role, that to just do that at that time of the event?
You know, it's hard to know. It's hard to, because the history so much means his story. It's sort of the story that somebody projects backwards, and you can write it a dozen different ways. It felt to me like Maharaji, that was Maharaji's grace that was doing that, because that book, Be Here Now, which really millions of people have been touched by in that kind of realm of consciousness about shifting their perspective about time, that came out of, as far as I can understand it, really one blessing out of his, one thought form out of him. When in India he said, one of Haridas came to me one day and he said, Maharaji wrote on a slate, Maharaji just sent his blessings for your book. And I said, what book? He said, whatever book you're writing. I said, I'm not writing any book. And that book turned out to Be Here Now. And it feels to me like it was interesting, it almost served as a Bible in the 60s for a certain kind of spiritual group, a subgroup. I feel very little personal identity with it. I feel very much like I was just a middleman for something to happen in that. You know, very much less personal. I think it did play an interesting role. I think that and a lot of other books with it. I mean, it's presumptuous to think that any one book did anything. Plus television and transportation and our changes in mobility and our changes. It was so overdetermined. The rock and roll movement, all of this, had the effect of changing our social psychological domain about time and space into relative time and space in the same way that Einstein did to Newton.
Yes, and it was a beautiful transformation. It was a total transformation to a new awareness, right
exactly.
there.
Exactly. We had the opportunity to see a shift in human awareness on a large scale.
Yes.
And it's interesting because it's so now been incorporated into the culture, nobody even notices that it happened. It's just built in now that we all, and that's part of why morality is changing, it's part of why everything's changing. It's changing around that shift about what reality is.
That's right. We are much more here now today than we ever were.
Much more, yes.
Now this brings about a rather interesting subject of evolution. We were talking about nonlinear time. And in nonlinear time, past, present, and future all occurs together, right? So how can one define the concept of evolution? You know, when we talk about here now in societal terms, we often get carried away and think, well, we are evolving towards a new consciousness. Yet, I find something inherently disturbing in thinking about evolution because everything is happening always already
Evolution is
put
as
it.
much an illusion as anything else.
Precisely.
And it's within the illusion, it's like a greater illusion within the elusive system, the illusory system, that there is movement from a point to another point or something's happening. And within the something's happening, you can get into vaster and vaster what I call astral melodrama, which has in it evolution. And finally, at the ultimate point of evolution, you realize nothing happened. You know, and that the ultimate final point is the awakening out of the dream of Maya, or the dream of
So in that sense, evolution never really happens. Actually, I would be a little more specific, in fact. Very great thinkers like Sri Aurobindo or Desjardins, science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. They all somehow conceptualize this collective nirvana of everybody in the universe all together, melting into one part of great ultimate consciousness.
Yeah. Well, that already is somewhere. It's just that we are busy being our storyline, so we aren't fully in it. But that's who we all already are. We all already are the Buddha, or the Buddha mind, or the Christ consciousness.
But that is not an end of something. I mean, there is no end, and there is no beginning.
There's no end, and even the concept of end and beginning is a hype.
Right.
Which is, at the lower levels of awareness, there are shifts in consciousness. Just like we were talking about, the input of relative realities into a society, everybody's consciousness goes up just a little bit. And there are those movements and progressions, and at the same place, at another level, there's nothing happening. So those are both true within that domain.
Right. And in that sense, perhaps it can be said
There's
that
evolution.
Yes, there is evolution.
Yeah.
And in my hypothesis is that the universe, the material universe, physical universe, and the consciousness are perhaps complementary aspects of one reality. And whereas this material universe has this one kind of cycles, like universe is created, destroyed, and so forth.
Yeah.
The consciousness
Beautiful.
is timeless and spaceless.
Yeah.
Does not have that kind of cycles. Yet it has this Mayic cycles of what you call
Exactly,
different
and I
astral.
think what the complementarity is within the Mayic cycle. See, I think we still have to get the better language to deal with consciousness, with awareness and those levels, so that we can deal with that which doesn't change as an eternal, and that which is the lower levels of those which is within the Maya. Because
which do
change, yes.
Right.
And those changes are complementary to the material one.
Yes.
And it's interesting because as those changes of consciousness occur, our understanding of what science is, our ability to know, our ability to trust our intuitive knowing, all these things happen. So that you can see that as physicists and biogeneticists and all get out to the leading edge, simultaneously as this consciousness moves from, as we allow relative reality into our own awareness, we are ready for that. And you can feel those things dovetailing just beautifully. So it's fun for you to be in the role you're in now in society, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, it is fun most of the time. There are, of course, also times where we all get confused. And I was going to ask you about this. One of the problems that we have in Western society, because of this democratic stuff that we get very used to, and everybody has to have the same kind of cars or same kind of pleasure, like a television set, and so forth. That coming from that point of view, here one feels dejected, not quite with it. I'm not ready for consciousness because I have to worry about my food every day.
Yeah.
And in the academia, what that means is that, well, I'm in this role of being a physicist, and therefore I have to do some grubby work with what is defined for me.
Yeah.
You know, like the physics is defined, and for a psychologist, the psychology is defined. Now, if you stay in that role, which has, of course, very nice aspects, namely that you can go for knowing the consciousness, knowing reality. Yet, there is also these aspects of getting into things which are grubby.
But I think what that is a confusion of what yoga is appropriate for somebody in a specific worldly household or role, in a worldly role. And I think that when you think of jnana yoga, of the yoga of the mind beating the mind, you think, well, if I'm doing grubby physics things, I can't be doing the mind beating the mind. But if you do karma yoga, which is taking your karma, which is doing the grubby physics things, and use those as the vehicles for awakening, then it all becomes grist for the mill. It all becomes stuff that allows you to awaken. I mean, very often a woman will come to me and she says, I have a child, and if I didn't have this little child, I could meditate, and I could get to God. And I say, well, if your child is standing in the way of you getting to God, you're not understanding how to use your karma, as how to make your karma dharma, how to use what you've got to liberate you. And you can, just as Yashoda looks at Krishna, who's the little baby, and it's the little baby, and then at some point Krishna opens his mouth and she sees the entire universe in his mouth, and she freaks, because this is her child, and suddenly she's holding this thing, this cosmos. And at that point, it's this beautiful line in which it says, then Krishna, out of compassion, veiled her eyes once again with mother love. See, and then she was just seeing the baby again. But yet, the whole role of raising a child is a vehicle of liberation if one uses it that way. And so dealing with grubby physics problems.
Yes.
It's the question whether you identify with your thought process.
Yes.
If you're busy thinking you're a physicist or thinking about those grubby problems and that's all you're doing, if you don't have that little bit of spaciousness around it that is saying, watch my attachment, see how I'm getting caught, oh, notice that,
yes.
See, that's the part that can use it.
Yes. You have given very good examples of this when in your earlier books you talked a lot about your relationship with parents. And there is a, well, here I am saying my mantra while my father continues about my mother's death, and I don't want to hear that, but this is, I suppose, what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah, yeah. My father and I, for example, and my stepmother play Yahtzee, which is it's a little game with dice, and it's a very simple little game. And we play it almost every night, part of our little dance together. Now, I could, if I were busy being a Yahtzee player, I would be bored to distraction, right? But I'm really not. I'm just a spacious being who happens to be playing Yahtzee at that moment, just like at this moment my heart's beating and my digestive tract is working. And I'm just appreciating the whole phenomenon. And there is a spaciousness that creates a vibratory rate that is very different from the vibratory rate that would be created if I were busy being a Yahtzee player. And as we play Yahtzee, my father and my stepmother, very slowly the whole vibration changes until in that situational condition, nobody there is playing Yahtzee, although we are all playing Yahtzee. We have transcended it. It's a contact high, if you will, out of that moment. Right? Now, there's no way that I can express that to them or train them, or because they don't want to, nor do they need to. I'm just doing my part, and their experience. So they end up, they can't get to the Yahtzee board fast enough, although they don't know why. It's a great game.
Yes, often it happens that people develop some rituals, and they know that something happens during the ritual. They don't know why.
And then they get hooked on the ritual if they don't understand. That's part of what religion has been the history of.
Also part of what relationships are about. Like we get into the marriage ritual, and some things happen and some things don't happen. We get stuck up into the aspects that happen and don't realize what makes us ecstatic.
Beautiful.
Let's talk about a very confusing subject for a little bit: self-will, or free will, and determinism. Now, of course, scientists are used to be completely caught up in determinism. Ever since Descartes saw this automatic machine in the Palace of Versailles, there is this story, and he saw these things work beautifully, the machines, and he thought, aha, God's world must work the same way. And Newton came around and he made these laws, and everything seemed to work that same way for quite a while, for 200, 300 years, I would say. And then only recently we're beginning to realize that no, it quite doesn't. It does not quite work in the deterministic fashion. But then there's confusion again, because you introduce the idea of indeterminacy, and that too tend to disappear when you introduce these ideas of cosmic consciousness. Or is there somebody behind the scene who is the really one who is pulling the strings, and there isn't really any free will, but everything happens, you just do your thing? How do you deal with that?
Well, in your comment just now, you covered at least 5 levels of consciousness, 5 levels of reality, all right? And in a way, they are all relatively real. So that there is a plane at which, like you and I chose to be here together for this interview, that is a level at which we subjectively experience free will. But you and I both know that those thought forms that made us decide this didn't come out of a vacuum. They came out of previous thoughts and experiences and our reading in these realms and so on. And so in the sense that was all lawful. We know that one level back, it's pretty much within law. Within a larger relative reality, it is determined.
Yes.
Now then you say, but within a larger relative reality, it is again undetermined. And then you say, within a larger relative reality, which is God, it is again lawful, even the indeterminacy, right? And in a way, those are all systems that are all equally relatively real. So that to say, is it determinism of free will, is just a confusion. That's another one of those paradoxes. That the answer is they're both true, but they're only relatively true. They're not absolutely true. And the confusion is that when we say, is it this or that, we are talking about something in a kind of horizontal saying, is it within the same plane of reality? And these are true across planes of reality. And paradox always can continually exist across planes.
Yes, and paradoxes never stop. By the very nature of it, there is no end to the paradox.
There's no end to the paradox, exactly. And
now,
being comfortable with paradox is part of what these changes of consciousness are.
Right. And in some sense, being enlightened means being able to live with paradoxes with perfect calm.
Exactly, yeah.
There is, however, in some of the places you make the comment and make it very well, that ultimately there is just one item of ultimate free will. When you go through the sixth chakra in your language,
yeah.
and you come to acceptance of nirvana or not,
yeah.
then whether you are going to go into it or coming out of it, not go into it, come to serve, that is an ultimate choice that all humans have.
Yeah, that's the beauty.
Obviously, Nim Karoli Baba had been there. And he comes back and serves. Now, when you meet him, what happens to your free will? Because Nim Karoli Baba, of course, changes things radically. I mean, he becomes the undetermined element within what you say, the dharmic law.
Yeah.
And since you are attached to that undetermined element yourself,
yeah.
don't you get an element of free will by association with the Guru?
That's incredible. I think what happens is that I just expand out into another system in which the determinacy is by a different set of laws than the laws of determinacy by which we usually play. We just went through to that third plane we're talking about the determinacy behind the indeterminacy. And that's what I tune into, because I felt when I was around Maharaji like a marionette being played with on strings, and yet I didn't feel like he was doing it to me. I just felt that I was a totally programmed entity. Not by anybody. It's not paranoia that somebody's doing it to me. I may be doing it to myself. But I saw that everything that was in form, thought, body, action, feelings, were all within that system.
Is that where your image of I'm just a renter came from?
Exactly. And that all form was going to be within some kind of law, whether you call it the Tao, the natural law, or whether you try to, it's not man law, it's not rational law, analytic law, but it's law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The confusion, of course, in the social regime, we find tremendous confusion because of this free will or deterministic context that we all have. You have touched upon things like getting involved in suffering versus getting involved with knowing yourself, and how to resolve that. That is, do both. But how could you elaborate on that? I mean, right now, today, there is just so much of social consciousness work that we seem to feel that we need to do.
Oh, absolutely.
Whereas it cannot be done without working on ourselves.
Yeah.
So, what should we really do? I mean, how much social involvement should we have, and how much of the personal
From
work?
a point of view of the ultimate relief of suffering, the amount of social action should be based on your level of evolution, meaning your ability to stay conscious in the action, meaning not identifying with being the actor or not identifying with the fruits of the action in the Bhagavad Gita sense. So at some stages, you can be very little into social action because you'll get caught almost immediately. And the minute you're caught, you are actually producing the opposite effect of what you're trying to produce. The more conscious, the more spaciousness there is in your awareness, the more you can be in social action, more of the time, until finally, like a Gandhi or somebody like that, can be in social action almost all the time. And through his spinning and through his meditation, can just keep the thread going so he doesn't get lost. But the question is, when you get lost, when is the fire going to burn you, and when is it going to purify you? And finally, there's nothing else to do but do what you can to relieve suffering. But unless you have the spaciousness, the awareness around it, so you don't get lost in identifying with being the doer, you keep creating more of the suffering. And that's the higher wisdom that makes social action such an interesting phenomenon, because everybody gets sucked in. I get sucked in all the time. Because every time I give a lecture and I talk about doing social action, people come up and say, "It's so wonderful you're doing that. You're so good." And you just keep getting fed for being responsible, caring about things. And for me to say, "Look, I don't care, I'm just doing it," people, that's a horrendous thing. I've learned how not to say things that I'm not supposed to say, because at some level it's all perfect. It's all doing fine. But you say perfect? Bangladesh is perfect? The violence in the starvation in Biafra is perfect? Iran is perfect? So you don't say that anymore. You say, "Oh, it's terrible, terrible, we've got to do something about it." And inside, you appreciate the perfection of it,
Yet you appreciate with compassion. That is, the compassion never leaves.
Well, compassion is the balance of those two things. Or what I call a balance of the heart and the head. Because the head, the sixth chakra, sees the perfection. The heart is the link to the humanity. And the heart is constantly going out for and feeling the suffering and identifying with. See, the fourth chakra isn't emerging with. The fourth chakra still keeps the entity separate. It's an empathic relationship. It's the first one of, say, brotherhood or humanhood or something like that. The sixth chakra is already getting close to the one. It's standing back and seeing the perfection. And the balance of those two is really where the secret of the game is. And when you have those perfectly balanced, your every act is compassionate. The minute it gets off, the minute there's pity instead of just an appreciation, it's not compassionate anymore. It's all out of ego,
Actually, that's where the other problem that comes in working with yourself versus working in social regions of activity. Namely that, you wrote Grease for the Mule, which also affected my consciousness enormously. And it has one line where you start a chapter by saying, "We are here to become nobody special."
Yeah.
And that just hit me in the heart.
Yeah.
But how do you, in trying to be nobody special, of course you don't try to be, but you, I know, I don't know how to express it, but you are trying to be nobody special, yet you know that in social action, if you are somebody, it works better.
Yeah, but you're somebody in the sense of rent-a-roll. You see, you're a rent-a-somebody. You become somebody in that situation. You're not anybody. It's merely a functional somebodiness. I mean, functionally, you're a teacher of physics. That doesn't mean you have to be a teacher of physics. You're just a being who happens to be teaching physics. So when I say to you, "Who are you?" you could say, "I'm a physics professor." But that's only one label. You're also a husband. You're also, of Indian origin. You're also a man. What labels? Which labels do you want to use?
That's right. And all those labels are really renter labels.
They're just labels, sure. You just go in and out of them.
Yes.
And your ability to die and your ability to grow with changing times, economics, politics, body, age, is all your ability not to identify. If you identify, you suffer. If you do not identify, you don't suffer. It's as simple as that.
Also, not only that, I mean, not only you suffer, but perhaps many other people's sufferings are brought about by this label.
Everybody suffers. You just leave a sea of it behind you. That's all.
Yes. So therefore, it follows that if we could have more conscious leaders, like, just coming back to the political scene of today, in America, if there were people in the State Department who were more conscious, wouldn't that really alleviate a lot of suffering around the world, like in Iran?
Sure, but that's asking a lot. We just don't have wise men, wise people, and we don't have them because we haven't nurtured them in the first place, but also because we don't make the distinction any longer between authority and power. You see, Samat Guru Ram Das is a good example. He was the guru to King Shivaji in 1600. He lived in a little mud hut next to the palace, right? He lived there very humbly. But every time the king's ego got out of hand or the king lost it, Shivaji was there to kind of get him straight. We used to have that role, say, between academia and politics. Now we don't have it anymore. Academia now are bought into politics. They're a wing of politics. And they're experiencing power. George Bundy or a Kissinger or, all of these people are now part of the power structure. And you can't play that much with worldly power and stay conscious without being an incredibly evolved being, really.
Yes, and that is very clear from what is coming out from Kissinger's role in the Iran game, that he could not keep himself separate.
No, exactly. Exactly.
That's very unfortunate. Yet there is the feeling that, in biology they say, well, if you are hitting upon something that's going to affect your survival, then you are prepared to evolve. So now we are talking about evolution of consciousness, and here we find that if some evolution of consciousness of the statesmen of our country does not work, does not operate, does not become, then total destruction of the humanity could happen.
Could happen, absolutely.
Therefore, isn't it just an automatic guess, a scientific axiom, you might say, that an evolution is bound to occur, because otherwise the species would be extinct. It's a survival thing.
Maybe it will be extinct. I mean, the question is, does your consciousness flicker when you think of that possibility?
Yes,
that may be the way it's going to go. I don't know how it's going to go. I'm not even sure I care how it's going to go. It's going to be interesting either way it goes. It may be that this crisis forces a raise in consciousness of political people. It may be that the way God designs the game, or the way we design the game, that consciousness of the environment forces the whole political thing to a higher level of consciousness, of compassion. Usually that kind of higher consciousness, which is a situational thing, can happen out of fear as well as out of wisdom. It's interesting, for example, in the Second World War in the United States, when there was a real threat to the security of this country, that we might get bombed and so on, suddenly there was incredible collaboration among people, and a more compassionate, higher thing came out of each person. It's all in there. Everybody's got the whole business inside themselves.
Sure.
But what are the situations that bring it out? It has to be that you don't feel you have the cards in your hand. You've got to have fear or despair. Those are the prerequisites for that game. And we as a society are so young and so arrogant, at least in the United States. We can't handle our fear without just getting more authoritarian.
We have never known it.
No, we haven't known it, And those are the necessary prerequisites for that.
Yes.
It may well be that we'll just, we may be training a whole generation of wise human beings. That would be lovely.
I'm reminded of a story I just heard. Hans Bethe, he's physicist, Nobel laureate again.
Yes.
And he was asked recently while he was giving a talk that he is an advocate of nuclear energy. That should be said first. And he was asked, shouldn't we start conserving energy, and doesn't that mean that we really have to reduce our lifestyles? And he said that, look, I was in Germany in the 30s, and that's what they tried to do in Germany, and look at what happened, World War. So it is very dangerous to talk about changing lifestyles or bringing the standard of living down. That's the way he felt.
Oh, that's such well, that's coming out of philosophical materialism. See, what fascinates me is that the voluntary simplicity, the simplicity that is going to be required from an economic and political and social, that's going to be forced on people, is exactly the kind of simplicity that becomes desirable as you spiritually evolve. See, simplicity, it's like when Gandhi said, civilization is the art of voluntary renunciation. That the more civilized you are, the more you let go of stuff you don't need in order for everybody to have something equally. That's a civilized. We are not yet a civilized people. We are an arrogant intellectual people. We are not a civilized people yet. And we may just be on the edge of it. We may become civilized before we destroy ourselves, and we may not.
Well, it has been a very enjoyable
It sure has
conversation.
been. It's absolutely been a delight. Just a total delight. Really, really. I feel we meet in heart and mind, you know.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.